I reached the boarding gate still carrying the ache of a short, restless night. People moved in a slow, shuffling rhythm, some impatient, others simply defeated by travel. I just wanted to slip into my seat, close my eyes, and let the hours fold over me. But my sister caught me before anonymity in the crowd could. She appeared polished, refreshed, almost luminous in that way she cultivated, expensive fabrics, subtle fragrances, gestures that declared she belonged somewhere above everyone else. Her gaze skimmed over me, searching for flaws the way one checks for lint before a photograph. When she found whatever she wanted, her mouth tilted into that familiar half-smirk. Pathetic. Still economy, she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, soft enough to pretend innocence if I reacted. I tried to breathe past it. She always struck quickly, as if humiliation were her native language. I told myself this trip wasn't about her. I had promised our mother I would be present, that I would try again, even though every attempt left new bruises inside me. Still, the comment landed where it always did, somewhere behind my ribs, where confidence tended to erode quietly. Before I could answer, the boarding agent lifted the microphone and called my name. Not hers. Only mine. The sound carried through the gate with an odd sharpness, slicing the moment in two. For a second, my sister's smirk flickered. She stepped aside as if the world had suddenly shifted a fraction of a degree out of alignment. I approached the desk, unsure whether I had made a mistake on my reservation. Maybe my card had been declined. Maybe there was a problem with my documents. Routine inconveniences, those I could handle. But the agent greeted me with a politeness I wasn't accustomed to in airports. She explained that the flight was overbooked, and a seat had opened in another cabin. She asked if I would accept an upgrade. My sister was close enough to hear. I didn't turn toward her, but I felt the weight of her attention suddenly tighten, like a grip at the back of my collar. I nodded, still trying to piece together the unfamiliar sensation of something unexpectedly going right. The agent handed me a new boarding pass, thicker paper, different color, and with it came a strange mix of relief and dread. I didn't want to gloat. I didn't want revenge or validation. I only wanted a quiet seat and a few hours where I didn't have to brace myself. But when I stepped away from the counter, my sister stopped me with a hand on my arm. Her touch was light but charged, like static before a storm. "What did you do?" she asked. No anger yet, just suspicion, sharpened by the idea that fairness had betrayed her. "Nothing," I said. "They just..." She didn't let me finish. Her expression hardened into something cold, almost surgical. Maybe she couldn't stand the thought of me being lifted even an inch above her, even by accident. Maybe the upgrade felt like an indictment of her own worth, as if the universe had rearranged itself and forgotten to consult her first. Passengers behind us shuffled impatiently, but she stared at me as though waiting for me to confess to a crime I hadn't committed. Moments like this always brought back the same memory, her pulling the ladder up behind her every time I tried to climb. I stepped away, pretending not to see the irritation blooming on her face. I told myself it didn't matter. A seat was a seat, a few hours in a different cabin wouldn't rewrite the last 20 years of our lives. Still, as I walked toward the priority line, I felt a tremor of unease. Not excitement. Not vindication. Something heavier, a warning pressed into the edges of my thoughts. I recognized it instantly, the same instinct that had whispered to me through our childhood fights and our adult silences. The sense that whenever something briefly improved for me, some equal and opposite force in her would flare awake. And I was right. She followed me into the line she wasn't allowed to join, her voice lowered but sharpened. "This isn't fair," she murmured. "It should have been me." Her words weren't loud enough for anyone else, but they echoed inside me. I tried to ignore them. The line moved. People scanned passes, stepped forward. The aircraft door waited just ahead, a threshold to temporary peace. But as I approached the attendant, my sister spoke again, quiet, controlled, almost trembling beneath her practiced composure. You always take what isn't yours. I didn't respond. I couldn't, not without unraveling in front of strangers. I simply handed over my pass and stepped toward the jet bridge. For the first time in years, I didn't look back to see if she was watching. Yet the unease followed me onto the plane, settling beside me like an uninvited passenger. I had no way of knowing that the upgrade was not the real turning point. The moment that mattered had already happened, at the gate, in the brittle crack of her composure and the quiet, dangerous envy that replaced it. Everything that came after would grow from that single fracture. The cabin smelled faintly of citrus and recycled air. My upgraded seat felt foreign beneath me, leather cool against my thighs, a little more space to breathe, a little less of the compressed world I had lived in for most of my life. I should have been pleased, grateful, even. Instead, the newness felt guilty, like stealing warmth from someone who had always sat closer to the fire. I tried to lose myself in the hum, the low thrum of engines, the soft thunk when a cart rolled by, the pilot's clipped announcements. I watched the shoreline slide away through the window and thought about negligible things, the shape of clouds, the rhythm of my own breath, until the sound of my sister's voice reappeared, low and purposeful, from a row back. She spoke into her phone as if rehearsing. I caught fragments, names, places, a clipped laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The syllables pulled at a place inside me I had long learned to ignore, not exactly fear, not exactly anticipation, but a sense that she was arranging pieces on a chessboard I didn't know we were playing. When we landed, the world tasted of jet fuel and warm plastic. People moved like they had somewhere to be, the airport already reshaping itself into a new day. I fumbled for my passport without thinking, fingers searching through my bag the way they always had, methodically, because if you look like you know what you're doing, people assume you do. It wasn't there. My chest tightened with a small, absurd hope that it had simply shifted deeper, wedged under a paperback, hiding. I dug, palms suddenly too clumsy, sweat cold behind my collar. The overhead light seemed too bright, conversations blurred into a static tide. I pulled everything out, receipts, a half-empty water bottle, a travel pillow, and finally the slim passport cover. My throat unclenched. Until I opened it. The laminated photograph looked like me, yes, but the name printed beneath it was not mine. 2 lines below my birthdate was a different surname, a different set of digits. A bureaucratic error, I thought. An airline mistake. I caught sight of my sister in the crowd. She had already walked ahead, and called to her, not with anger, but with the sudden, animal need to be made visible. She turned slowly. In the motion she was a portrait of care, hand on hip, brow furrowed the way it always furrowed when she wanted a role to fit. She approached with that small smile that had always done half the work of confession for her. "Are you okay?" she asked, loud enough that a nearby passenger glanced over. I held up the passport without thinking, as if displaying evidence in a trial. "This isn't mine," I said. Her face changed, the warmth replaced by something sharper, more efficient. For a heartbeat I saw a flicker of something like regret, then it was gone. "Maybe you grabbed mine by mistake," she said. "We did swap seats at the gate so you could board faster." It was a plausible excuse. It fit tidy lines I had been taught to accept, siblings borrowing, mix-ups, the small chaos of travel. Airport staff filed us through with their practiced patience. But when we reached the immigration desk it stopped being plausible. The officer asked for my name. My name didn't match the passport. He asked for my boarding pass. The barcode didn't scan cleanly. The line tightened behind us into a chorus of coughs and shuffling feet. She said, with the same soft control she used when smoothing our mother's hair in the hospital, "We just need to sort this out." Sort this out. The phrase landed like a verdict. I felt the world compress into slow, glassy movements, the officer's fingers tapping keys, his face folding into a professional neutrality that meant he was already preparing to unmake me, the murmurs of nearby travelers like insects around a light. They asked me to come to the side. Not admonition, something colder, exact and efficient, a small room with a bench and a table, a fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead. Someone took my phone and asked routine questions that felt designed to map me into a grid of officialness. At some point a woman in plain clothes entered and asked me my mother's name, my date of birth, my address. I answered because there is a part of us trained from childhood to comply with numbered lists. My sister sat across from me on the other side of the glass, hands folded as if at prayer. She spoke to the officers in a tone that was both soothing and precise, narrating small truths about me that somehow did not add up to a whole. I listened to her describe me the way someone reads aloud a catalog entry, neutral, trimmed of tenderness. When they finally allowed me to call our mother, the phone felt like a stranger's limb. I could hear the faint paper rustle in the background and my mother's breathing, shallow, deliberate, and then our sister's voice sliding into the space as if to moderate the call. "She must have taken the wrong passport," she said, "nothing urgent, everything explanatory. I'll bring the correct one." My mother didn't speak. Her silence was a small clarifying thing. She was a patient in a hospital, not a judge in an airport. She had lost the steadying shore she had once been. The phone went dead, the line clipped like a ribbon. Left alone in that fluorescent room, a slow panic settled in with the gravity of a tide. My hands trembled. I thought of small humiliations from childhood, a dinner table where my sister's laughter always filled the room and mine was discipline, a teacher's phone call home whose moral came with my sister's name on it. I thought of the long, invisible ledger that keeps account of favors and debts, and how I had been taught to pay mine through silence. I didn't understand, at first, why the absence of a passport would feel like the exact center of everything. Later I would realize the truth. She wasn't trying to humiliate me at an airport. She wanted to make me disappear long enough for something else to be set into place. The officers escorted me to a holding area where a kindly security woman offered me a paper cup of tea and a plastic chair. The tea tasted of emptiness and sugar. They left the door ajar so I could see fragments of the terminal world, a child with a dinosaur backpack, a man arguing softly with a travel agent, and I felt naked in the visibility of strangers' lives moving with the steady, indifferent machinery of the world. When my sister returned, she carried herself like a woman who had solved an equation. She placed a passport on the table between us, mine, apparently, and leaned forward as if to close the space. "There it is," she said. "You just mixed them up." I wanted to believe her. I wanted, more than anything, to be uncomplicated. I reached for the passport because reaching for a thing is an act that undoes suspicion. In that movement there is trust in small logistics. My fingers brushed the cover and I felt, sudden and sharp, the chill of being deliberately misread. She had smiled at me once, before we left the gate. I had accepted that smile as a familial thing, reflex, affection. Now it registered as a practiced expression, a tool calibrated to get a reaction. She wanted witnesses. She had staged a scene that placed me in the middle of it, confused, exposed, and suddenly dependent on her version of the truth. After that day, I would piece things together in the backward light we call hindsight. I would learn about bank transfers and forged signatures, about emails sent in my name, about a quiet campaign to make others see me as careless, unreliable, someone not fit to hold responsibility. In that moment, though, the realizations were slow to arrive. They came in the form of memory, not the big, cinematic flashback but the small, precise things: a burned photograph tucked into a book, a toothbrush that wasn't mine, the subtle shift in the household accounts when our mother's health had turned. I sat and watched my sister perform competence. She negotiated with an air of ownership. She apologized for me in a way that felt like an indictment. I'm sorry she causes trouble. She promised to stay until things were resolved, and in that promise there was a tacit ownership. The more she vowed to fix me, the more I felt myself shrinking, becoming an object of caretaking rather than a person with agency. When they finally released me, it was with the same bureaucratic disregard as everything else: a stamp, a curt nod, a check. She walked with me to the taxi queue and for a long while we rode in silence. The city rolled by in familiar apartments and neon signs and the occasional dog on a leash. I wanted to ask why, to demand explanation, to break the current of her carefully arranged normalcy. I wanted to accuse her of orchestrating the whole thing. Instead, I kept my mouth closed. There is a particular erosion that comes from being endlessly explained away by someone you once loved. Accusation felt like throwing a stone into a river. It would make a splash, yes, but the current would keep moving and the stone would sink. That night, alone in the small room at my mother's house, I found an email tucked into a folder I had forgotten. It was addressed to me, from our mother, simple, domestic. She wrote of a small apartment she wanted to leave me, the place with the green shutters she always loved, a modest insurance policy to cover a year of rent. It was nothing grand, but it was proof that she had been thinking of me, protected, perhaps, in ways that did not require my sister's approval. The revelation should have felt like a bomb. Instead it flared like an ember, warm, then suddenly dangerous. The details in the email made everything fall into a new pattern. The document asked me to meet our mother at the hospital in 2 days to sign small clerical forms. It mentioned the name of the attorney handling the paperwork. I read it until my eyes were tired and the words blurred. In the small hours, I replayed the day in my head and the pieces began to align the way a map clicks together. The passport. The public confusion. The way my sister had been so ready to narrate my carelessness to strangers. The patient silence on the phone from a woman who could barely choose the right syllable. It was not care she was offering. It was containment. She had turned a mistake into a script in which she played the author and I, unwillingly, was her protagonist. I thought of sacrifice then, not the noble, romantic kind, but the slow, daily sacrifices we make when we bend ourselves into roles to secure a fragile truce. I had spent years narrowing my life to fit through the spaces others left for me: small jobs, quiet apologies, rearranged schedules to ferry our mother to appointments. Each concession had been a talisman I believed would buy me a safe harbor. It had not. It had only made me predictable. The trauma of the day was not the passport, not the holding room. It was the recognition that my sister's attention could so easily become a mechanism of control, that the person I had loved enough to forgive 1,000 times could also be the architect of my erasure. That recognition settled into my bones like a cold I could not shake. When dawn came and the house around us hummed with the soft machinery of caregiving, machines beeping, nurses whispering, a kettle sighing, I made a decision that felt both small and vast. I would go to the attorney alone. I would not ask my sister for explanations. I would not let her be the only voice at the table. It felt like stepping toward a thin thread of agency I had forgotten I possessed. I did not know, not yet, if the thread would lead to anything other than a longer, harder unraveling. But it was a start. And as the light grew, it illuminated the outline of a plan I had not yet named: to find the evidence and to speak, with a voice that would not be explained away. Morning loosened itself slowly, as if reluctant to expose what the night had crystallized. I moved through the house with the quiet instinct of someone trying not to disturb an old wound. My mother slept in uneven breaths, her face hollowed into a softness I barely recognized. I kissed her forehead the way she used to kiss mine when fevers claimed me, and for a moment I allowed myself to forget the unraveling. But the moment passed. It always did. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I walked the 12 minutes to the attorney's office, each step deliberate, not confident, but necessary. The building was unassuming, a rectangle of glass and muted stone tucked between a bakery and a dentist's clinic. The waiting room was filled with the hum of photocopiers and the distant ring of phones, the small machinery of other people's crises. When the attorney called my name, something in me steadied. His office was warm and overlit, with too many files stacked on the edge of his desk. He looked at me with a kind of measured recognition, as if he had been expecting the version of me who had walked in, wary, exhausted, not afraid of documents but of what they implied. He slid a folder toward me. "Your mother wanted these finalized," he said. "She spoke of ensuring you had a foundation once, things changed." The folder was thicker than I expected. Inside were drafts of a modest will, the transfer of the apartment with the green shutters, the insurance policy meant to cushion the freefall after she was gone. My name was printed clearly, rhythmically, across multiple pages, a small but startling validation. I flipped through the documents with careful fingers, feeling the edges catch against my skin. Nothing seemed fraudulent. Nothing hinted at interference. Until I reached the final page. There, in the space for a witness signature, was my sister's name. The handwriting was precise, familiar, almost ceremonial, the same careful loops she used when signing birthday cards our mother never received. The attorney explained that she had visited the week before, insisting she was acting on my behalf. She had told him my schedule was unpredictable, that she wanted to streamline the process for our mother's sake. He had accepted her involvement because she provided the correct identification. Because she looked like someone who belonged in control. A dull pressure built behind my eyes. It wasn't shock, it was the slow confirmation of a pattern I had been trying not to acknowledge. She had inserted herself into documents that weren't hers. She had signed as a witness to choices she hadn't respected. And she had done it with the confidence of someone who assumed there would be no consequences. I asked the attorney to record, in writing, that I had been present today, that I had reviewed everything and would sign nothing without my mother's clear, conscious consent. He agreed, tapping his pen against the corner of the page as he added the notation. That small scratch of ink felt like the first real boundary I had ever placed between myself and my sister. When I left his office, the rain had finally arrived. It fell with the steady rhythm of inevitability. I walked home without an umbrella, letting the cold damp seep into my clothes. It grounded me, held me upright in its own brutal way. Inside the house, my sister stood at the kitchen counter stirring a cup of tea. She didn't look surprised to see me. She rarely looked surprised by anything. Control was her native climate. She glanced at the damp trail I left on the floor and raised an eyebrow. "You went out early," she said, voice smooth, as if the previous day had been nothing more than a mild misunderstanding. "I met with the attorney," I answered. There was no anger in my tone, just a flatness that her rehearsed expressions couldn't grip. "I saw the documents. Your signature." She didn't flinch. That frightened me more than an outburst would have. Her stillness was rehearsed, weaponized. She set down the spoon with careful precision and leaned back against the counter as though preparing for a negotiation she expected to win. "Someone had to take care of things," she murmured. "You're not always reliable." The words struck with the familiarity of an old bruise. Unreliable. The label she had been stitching to me for years, small thread by small thread, until even I sometimes believed it. But something had changed. Maybe it was the holding cell at the airport. Maybe it was my mother's frail breath against the pillow. Maybe it was the simple fact that I had seen my own name in writing, unaltered, unchallenged, and realized how easily it could be erased if I stayed silent. "You don't get to decide that," I said. Her jaw tightened. For the first time she looked unsettled, as though the ground had shifted an inch beneath her. "I've done everything for this family," she replied. "Everything. If I push, it's because someone has to." "I'm not your project," I said. "And you don't get to manage me." The words felt both foreign and strangely natural as they left my mouth, a language I should have learned years ago. Before she could respond, our mother called out weakly from down the hall. My sister stepped forward instinctively, but I moved before she did. I reached the room first. My mother's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, wandering. I sat beside her, holding her hand gently, the bones delicate under thin skin. My sister hovered behind me, a shadow made of tension. "She asked for you," I said quietly, not turning around. My mother squeezed my hand with surprising clarity. Her voice was thin, but the words were unmistakable. "I want you to sign," she whispered. "The papers, you. Not her." My sister inhaled sharply, the sound of a woman watching her scaffolding crumble. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The truth had landed, and its weight was finally visible. I stayed with my mother until her breathing steadied. When I left the room, my sister was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed tightly, face arranged into neutrality. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally she said, very quietly, "You think this changes everything?" "It doesn't change everything," I replied. "It only corrects one thing." She stared at me with a mixture of calculation and disbelief, as if measuring how far I was willing to go. But there was nothing left to measure. Her authority had been built on my silence, and I was no longer willing to supply it. In the days that followed, the truth unfolded in a slow, administrative unraveling. The attorney updated the documents with my explicit instructions. The hospital's social worker noted my mother's consent while she was lucid. I took custody of the paperwork before my sister could intervene again. There was no dramatic confrontation. No shouting, no scenes. Just the steady, inevitable shift of control back into the hands it belonged to. My sister withdrew into an almost ceremonial politeness, the brittle kind people adopt when they sense their influence thinning. The night my mother passed, the house fell into a fragile stillness. Grief does not choose sides, it simply moves through rooms, filling them with the absence of breath. My sister and I sat in separate parts of the living room, both wordless, both holding our own versions of loss. For the first time, I saw her grief as separate from her hunger for control, two parallel lines that rarely touched. In the weeks after the funeral, she packed her things with clinical efficiency. We exchanged the bare minimum of words, careful not to ignite anything unnecessary. On the morning she left, she paused at the doorway. "Take care of yourself," she said, almost softly. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. It was simply an acknowledgement that I existed outside her narrative, that my life was no longer a subplot in hers. After she drove away, I sat alone in the apartment with the green shutters. The light filtered through them in clean, steady stripes. The floor creaked the way old floors do when finally allowed to rest. It didn't feel like triumph. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the first deep breath after years of shortening every inhale. Justice, I learned, isn't loud. It arrives quietly, rearranging the shape of a life without ceremony. It leaves behind a space wide enough to build something new, not perfect, not unscarred, but finally my own.